Hi, you're watching 20 Questions with. My name's Harry Reardon. Thank you so much for watching. Before you do anything, make sure you hit like and subscribe. Today we're talking to Leena. Leena, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Leena. I am in my 30s and I am interested to be here and excited to be here to answer some questions about my experience.
That's it. Thank you so much. At what point did you realise that your parents were Islamic extremists?
It wasn't
Straight
until
into that.
years ago when I actually got out of that world, and I do use that terminology. So during my childhood, which I'm sure we'll go into, it was a lot of, I think, cognitive dissonance. You don't really think that that's going to be the case or the situation, so you start making excuses for people. Maybe they were translating things incorrectly. Maybe when they said that so-and-so attack was amazing, that they're using the wrong word. But I'd say the last couple of years have been a bit of a journey of realization, and probably having my own children has made me notice that a lot about my childhood was wrong, but that one was quite significant.
Can you give me an example of something that happened as a child that you didn't realise at the time had more impact than now?
Yes. So I can't remember what year it was, but there was some I think nightclub shootings, or it might have been a nightclub bombing somewhere in America. And I remember very, very explicitly my mother, saying, "Oh, did you hear about that happening? Wasn't that amazing?" Thinking about people being very deserving of, having terrible things happen to them as a consequence of how they were dressed or how they would behave. Saying that Kylie Minogue deserved to get breast cancer because she wore low-cut tops, for example. And listening to that but it's funny because to me now, telling you this, it sounds completely shocking and completely obvious. I think when you're in an environment and you think that you've got a loving relationship, I've got no contact with my family, my parents anymore, unless that, in case that wasn't clear. But you think that these could not be sincerely held views. It might be said with a bit of a joke or a smile. So people don't necessarily, you just think, oh, that's just a bit of an over-the-top way of talking. But now it's obviously clear that it's completely unacceptable. I used to go to school. I think also the issue was that this was so much part of my childhood. My family are like first generation immigrants to the UK. But I would go to school and tell people that my mom gasses people out, because that's what I was told to tell people. My mom gasses people out because she happens to be a doctor, an anaesthetist. So because she said that and she thought it was really funny as a joke, I would go telling people that at school. Now, if a child went into school and was using that kind of language that has connotations of the Holocaust, then it would be a sincere, safeguarding issue. Why is a 6-year-old talking in that way? Nobody said anything. Nobody picked up on it. So because it was normalized in lots of different spheres, I don't think I really noticed that was an issue. It's only on reflection, but I think, it's hindsight, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Your parents believe that the high rates of breast cancer in the West was punishment given to Western women for showing off their bodies. Can you say a little bit about that, please?
I mean, that sums it up, really. It was a very, very limited understanding of what. So I've got a complex relationship with faith and religion as well. So I no longer, I'm not a Muslim. I identify as an ex-Muslim. However, I have Muslim friends. I know that the vast majority of Muslim people do not believe that that is the case. Within their world, there was a conception that because of the very conservative approaches to how people should dress and the very prescriptive ways of how people should dress and how you shouldn't show off parts of your body, that anything which punished, it was almost like the way that people used to think that AIDS was like a punishment from God for people being gay, for instance. I can only compare it in those terms. But the idea was that was an amazing way, and that was the term that was used. Isn't it amazing that God would use something like this, and particularly a high-profile person like Kylie Minogue, say, who everybody knew, in order to punish? It was like divine justice, if you like.
Because if you asked most Muslim people, I'd go as far as to say that they wouldn't class extremists as Muslims, right?
Correct.
So your parents celebrated terrorist attacks and nightclub shootings. Can you elaborate on that? Like how so? I mean, obviously you've said before about the joking and the laughing, but what else followed?
So it was never, it wouldn't be a, right, let's sit down and talk about this and learn an important lesson about how the West is bad and, you know, this ideology is good or this is what we believe. It was more a general part of, you know, everyday conversation. It would be, you know, the same way that you might talk with your family about something that's going on in the news. It would be a passing comment, and I think that's why I didn't necessarily, I wouldn't say take it as seriously, but I almost like developed a reputation. And you need to understand that this was part of a bigger picture of a cycle of abuse. So I was, you know, significantly emotionally abused as a child. Again, things that I'm and physically abused, and things that I'm learning now. And it was only when I broke away from my family that I noticed this. But when something is a passing comment, or just, you know, everybody's got that person in the family who they're a little bit embarrassed about things that they say, and maybe you shouldn't say it in that way, you make excuses for them. So, for example, when there was the daughter of, I think it's the Dubai president, the guy, she was imprisoned and you know, abused because she was being too westernized. When that was discussed, it would be, well, you know, she deserved it. I don't know why everybody's complaining about it, or people are only showing one side of the story. If my daughter behaved in that way, or she spoke back, or she decided to wear short skirts, then that's just what you know, what happens. If there was a story about somebody getting raped, for instance, it was, well, why would you go out and get drunk? So when it becomes so kind of normalized as part of conversations, then you don't necessarily notice it as such. But I know, even saying that now, it makes me feel really uncomfortable. But you need to remember, I was a child and I was also kind of under the control. So it's not something I'm proud of that I didn't necessarily speak louder, but the consequences when I did speak out about things that concerned me explicitly were really quite severe. So all I can say is that I probably got regret in terms of not being louder and not getting out sooner, but it was very much an acceptable thing, and we were part of a wider community. It wasn't just my parents, it was part of the wider community that I grew up in, a kind of quite conservative pocket, but not, I think, what you might expect in terms of like a ghettoized community. We were seen from the outside as like this model of integration, you know, people, you know, there wasn't the stereotype that you might have of a family of immigrants, say.
So anti-Semitism also featured heavily in your family. How did that manifest?
So I'm really hesitant in how I say this, but I think that a lot of this, again, wasn't just my family. I think there was a cultural dimension to this as well. There was an idea of, so one of the big lines that was said to me quite a few times growing up was that Hitler was a hero for what he did to Jewish people. But it was almost, it's awful to say, but it was almost said in a, because of, and it was always kind of marked really with this political dimension as well, you know, because of what's happening in places like Palestine, or, you know, the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, that Arabs good, because, you know, I'm giving it away now, but, you know, I'm from an Arab background, Arabs good, you know, Israelis bad, and therefore you have the religious dimension that comes with it. But of course, as you say, most Muslims would say that that's completely unacceptable. It was much more about, this is what happened, and it came from the same source of, you know, laughing and joking. Sorry, I can see a comment. Is that meant to be for me?
Nice, for me.
My mistake, sorry.
Okay.
So the idea is that most Jewish people, you know,
it's for both of us. The question is,
anybody who had something bad happen to them and they were different to us because they didn't follow this particular branch of, you know, very conservative Islamic thinking, was seen as a terrible person. and deserving. And actually, more liberal Muslims didn't get off scot-free as well. It was such a restricted model of what it meant to be, the practicing of the faith. But it was very much tempered with the fact that my parents, particularly my mother, were very, very dominant forces in the household. It was a fear culture. You couldn't say anything that was any kind of form of dissent. So even when I started, as I got older, to realise that it was, this language and this rhetoric was completely unacceptable, I didn't feel like I could speak out, and it became like, that embarrassing uncle who might say something that's a little bit unacceptable, over the Christmas dinner table. But of course, it was much bigger than that, and I realised that it wasn't a joke as well when they turned on me.
So how did they turn on you?
So I met somebody who was not Muslim and had a relationship with them, and decided to continue with that, and essentially that's when everything went wrong. So my partner is my partner is from a completely different background to me, and for a while we pursued that relationship in secret, and when I decided that enough was enough, kind of, I guess, came out and revealed that not only was I in love with this person, but actually had no plans to continue with the faith. And that's when the verse about apostates being worthy of death, and whoever changes their religion kill them, which again, this is where I get very, very conflicted, because whilst I have Muslim friends who know this story and are completely outraged and disgusted by almost like the hijacking of their faith, and I would never say that all Muslims feel this way at all. However, there are kind of textual verses that we use to justify the very aggressive behaviour, but essentially they threatened to kill us, and we had to take measures to protect our identity, our location, when completely no contact. And it's at that point that I realised that a lot of these throwaway comments, which I dismissed as jokes and nothing of any consequence, actually real steps were taken to bring harm to us as a family.
Do you think they would have done it?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. No doubt in my mind at all. And not only would have done it, but actually have the means to, and have the means to be able to do serious harm.
And can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
I can a little bit. I can't say too much just for obvious reasons, but you're probably aware, and I'm sure your listeners are aware, that within particular communities, particularly some migrant communities, it's not just the immediate family, the family, the nuclear family unit, but it's part of a much wider community. There are members of the community that I grew up in and my family still have very strong ties with, who are powerful people politically in our home country. And news gets around very, very quickly of anything really, even if it's like frivolous gossip. But something like this, if news had got back to, and it would have got back to, I guess, people back home, those are people who have quite significant political power and have the potential to do real harm. They've got resources and the means too. So the steps that we've taken to protect our identity have been quite significant, and multiple services have been involved in order to ensure the case. Now, this all happened a few years ago, so we're kind of through the other side, if you like, in terms of understanding the threat. But most definitely, if we hadn't taken the drastic steps that we did, I think that we would have had. And I part of my work, I have worked in this sector before. I do a lot of work with charities that around honour-based abuse and honour-based violence. There are people in my wider community network and even in the extended family who are very violent and aggressive people and dangerous people.
So your husband, I'm assuming, uprooted his life as well?
To a certain extent, we to a lesser extent, actually, I'd say. We had to make the steps together as a family in order to protect ourselves, but we were fortunate, and actually at the point when I realised that things were amiss, and this was more on the abuse side rather than the Islamic-extremist side, the Islamic-extremist realisation came much later, almost like a kind of point of realization or self-discovery, we had already taken steps to distance ourselves geographically. And of course, there was no chance that I could do any of this until I was financially independent as well, and not reliant on my family for anything at all.
Did your husband help with that?
Did
your husband help with that?
Our finances have been shared for a long time, so it wasn't necessarily a concern. But we've known he's been aware of the situation and actually being witness to a lot of the things that have been said, and the way that things have the kind of the behaviour for a very, very long time. But it's taken me much, much longer, because I think that's the problem when you're in a family unit, isn't it?
Yeah. So how do you go day by day now? Do you still look over your shoulder? Do you still have those fears, those worries?
Yes, but to a much lesser extent. The first year was very, very, very difficult because we didn't have really a measure of the threat. But just to give you a picture, to give your listeners a picture, we had CCTV on our house. We had police protection. We had multiple services involved in order to keep us safe, and as well as a lot of advice. Although I will say that actually the system, I don't think is very equipped in certain parts of the country, maybe outside the big cities, to actually deal with this. We got a lot of, oh, this doesn't really happen around here, which is nonsense, by the way, because it happens everywhere. It's just not very talked about. I'd say that, at the moment, things are much safer. I feel like I'm a lot more savvy. Very, very, things like social media use and everything, being very careful with that. And then you realise, having worked, I try to use some of my experience for good, and I worked in this sector for a little while, and I continue to do volunteering. But you realise actually how the lengths that people will go. So, not only did I change my mobile phone number, but I realised that when you change your mobile phone number and you're in a WhatsApp group, even if you've, blocked the group, your number automatically changes in WhatsApp. So I had to change it again just afterwards. There have been multiple attempts to actually turn up. We moved house. They turned up at our old house and tried to find us, deliberately choosing times when they knew that we would, that I might be at home on my own. So being kind of quite vulnerable in that situation. Threats to go to places of work. Both my husband and I, at the time, were working in the public sector as well, which makes it extra difficult to actually kind of conceal who you are, because, you are in a public place and there are people who need to kind of know your real name from a safeguarding perspective. So I'd say at the moment, do I go around the street, look over my shoulder? Less than I did, but until we moved house, it took a while to move. I was, the curtain twitcher every time somebody pulled into our little cul-de-sac, because I didn't know who it was.
Would you say that that's like, even if your parents weren't extremists, would you say that that was a normal reaction for a Muslim family whose child had met a non-Muslim man?
It's a wide church, isn't it? A broad church, to use the wrong term, but there's a huge dive. I grew up being taught that to be Muslim means to believe this, and that's all it means. And if anybody doesn't believe exactly this and behave in exactly this way, then they are not Muslim. Like, I know now that that's not the case, and that people can identify in whatever way they want. However, it is the case that there are mainly women and girls having secret relationships and secret boyfriends up and down the country, and that nobody talks about it because they're scared to talk about it. And it's an honor code, and everybody knows about it, but nobody talks about it. I think that there is a big difference between conservative and extremists, and my family fall on the extremist side. But I'd say that the secrecy and the lengths that people have to go to with secrecy, the curtain twitching and the worrying and the not holding hands in public and the checking what's going on online and policing it. I had a million, before I stopped kind of going on Facebook and posting my life on there, I had a million different filters of what would appear to different people to make sure that this person doesn't share this photo with this person, because I heard stories in the community of girls who'd had their lives totally ruined. Their parents would not be defined as extremists, I think, in my mind, but they're definitely very, very conservative, and they've still got the potential to do a lot of emotional damage.
Absolutely. You said about the physical abuse that you suffered as well. Do you mind, if it's okay, you're right to elaborate a little bit on that?
So it's difficult to. So physical abuse. I mean, I was not fed very well as a child. I was kind of starved for a while, and then I was force fed. There was a lot of issues around food, and developed an eating disorder in my teenagers, which is unsurprising given the issues around food that I've learnt about later. So, beaten as a child, hit, attempted, but not. Luckily, somebody intervened, but attempted FGM when I was a baby. That was something that was quite the norm in the culture of the country that I come from, which I can't speak about.
What's FGM? Sorry, that I'm not
Yes,
familiar.
it's female genital mutilation. It's sometimes talked about as female circumcision. It's where they cut parts of your clitoris off, and it's illegal in the UK. And you now get something called a FGM protection order to stop it from happening.
Is that to stop pleasure during
Yes.
sex, to make it for procreation only? Yeah.
Yes. It is illegal in many, many, many countries, but continues to be practiced in many countries as well. And the country of my birth is a country where this practice is still done on lots of baby girls. And I've recently learned that this is something which was attempted on me, but for reasons that I won't go into, it didn't take place, which I'm very grateful for, of course. But in terms of the abuse, the physical abuse, it was extreme kind of chastisement and, discipline, essentially, which again was very much labeled as that's what we do in our culture. Most of the abuse that I experienced was emotional abuse, but it's very much tied in. And I would say that the faith was more kind of used as a bit of a weapon, and it was weaponized. And I would say that it's very difficult talking about this without demonizing a religion of however many billion people around the world, and that's what I really don't want to do. But my family were extreme and conservative in their views and believe that this is what they were taught to do, and that anybody who doesn't like it is going against the faith.
Yeah. So they also justified ISIS behavior as well as Hitler's.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to the extent of that?
So in terms of ISIS behavior, the feeling was that. So the explicit line that I remember being said and a lot of it is a bit of a blur, but because I'd left home by this point when ISIS kind of were on the rise, so a lot of this was kind of phone communication rather than in person. But the idea was that yes, you shouldn't kill innocent people. That was what said. Innocent people shouldn't be harmed. However, it is more important to fight for our rights. Like it's almost like a balance of good or bad. And if the consequence of kind of taking on our rights and fighting for our rights means that innocent people get harmed, then that is okay. But we shouldn't kill innocent people, if you see what I mean. So it was never as maybe as black and white as things that were more in the, I guess, the removed environment, but it was more thinking about, well, being a martyr is a good thing, like martyrdom.
So protect the faith, but if innocent people get killed in a crossfire, that is what it is.
It is what it is, but obviously I wouldn't do it myself, which is what led me to think, well, this is not something that, this is a belief rather than something that would actually take place. And again, it was only when they turned on us that I started to reevaluate what that actually meant. The explicit, when I said that I was no longer a Muslim, the line that was said to me was, you're very lucky that you live in a country which has a law which protects you, because people use and should use swords in the street for people like you. So the idea was that it was ignoring the fact that actually threatening somebody and speaking to somebody like that is also a bit illegal, isn't it? Like it's, threats of violence and it's intimidation. But that I was lucky to be protected by a law, because the actual, which would stop anybody from actually physically doing something to me.
Yeah.
And when that's your own mother, that's quite significant.
Yeah, that's quite bad. What do you think the root cause of your parents' extreme views are? Were their parents like that?
I think I think it's multifaceted. I think that to a certain extent it was a community feeling that these views were acceptable. I don't remember, put it this way, I remember a lot of people being really, really angry about, laws that were, in the community that were harming and kind of damaging our community, or when they decided that sex and relationship education would be compulsory, and there was flyering and picketing and saying that's really, really wrong. But I don't remember anybody condemning or talking really publicly about all of these, like things like ISIS and whatever, and saying that's really, really bad. So I think it was more like an acceptability of this, but they certainly didn't go about kind of talking in this way publicly. I think their parents did have those beliefs, but because they were first generation, I think there is a sense that I get that like communities who are first generation feel like a greater need to keep their children from being corrupted by like Western influences, so they go hard. But I also think that you've also got the emotional abuse side and the kind of the narcissism, where any kind of powerful ideology that leaves no room for dissent in the hands of somebody like that, and in the hands of abusers, is going to turn into something much greater. So I don't think it's just one factor.
Yeah. And you eventually left the faith behind.
Yeah.
Do you? So how is that now, raising children in a world completely different to the one you grew up in?
It's
Like, are you
it's
not saying?
liberating. So say that again, sorry.
Sorry, are you? Because there are a lot of things in Muslim culture that are vastly different. I mean, obviously that's the discussion, but I mean, even so, as to how you dress and modesty and how you approach certain subjects and
Mhm.
things like that. So, do you not have any fears about raising children in a world so different?
No, and I think that part of it is it feels liberating, and it also feels like I'm almost breaking this cycle, because you asked me before whether my parents were like that because their parents were like that, and there's an element of toxic attitudes kind of passing down the generation, and I feel like actually being able to decide what I think is right or wrong, and not having to do so just because I think just because I'm told that it's right or wrong, but actually kind of using critical reasoning is something that I find very very comforting. But it's also quite upsetting when my children kind of reach ages where I start to kind of remember or have knowledge of things that happened to me. It's also, it can be a little bit triggering to in a certain extent of, why they're getting, why did nobody kind of show that love or that compassion and whatever. But then you do it, you just do your best. I think it's all you can do. And I feel that the single biggest thing that I did, and I don't mean this for the faith, because I really want to kind of keep asserting that I think you can be a really wonderful parent and also be a Muslim. I think Islam is a huge body of so many people, but I think that for me it's about being able to make choices. And the biggest thing that I did was just get out of that abusive environment and that toxic environment and completely shield them from it. I'd like to think that if they were old enough to be able to know what happened, because my children are very young, they would be shocked and almost think like I was making this all up, because they wouldn't be able to conceive something like that. And that's my goal, really, as a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you ever going to tell them?
Yeah, for sure. But it's about how you do that. And as part of my volunteering, I work with a charity, and there's a community of us. We call it, it's called the Survivor Ambassador Panel, but it's all people who've had experience of honor-based abuse of some sort or another. And a lot of them are a lot older than me, and their children are a lot older than mine. So, I find it very comforting to kind of find out how they've navigated that, because you've got to do it carefully. You've got to make sure that they don't go the other way, right? And it's like, almost like forbidden fruit. And but they will know. They will know.
So there's going to be a few questions that might pop up in the group chat.
Okay.
If you want, feel free to answer them as we go. That was the previous one.
Yeah.
I'm going to rewrite this one into the chat for you as well.
Okay. Were my parents educated? I'm assuming this means, like, are they, they go to school, university, whatever? Yes, very. Professional jobs, fluent English, very much prided themselves actually on the level of education that they had, and that also that, very high educational standards for us as children.
Can you say that again? You cut out a little bit.
Yeah, I said very high educational standards for us as children, because I do have siblings. But yes, definitely very highly educated, and I would say that almost for them legitimize their approach as well, because it's that kind of the confidence that comes with having a high level of education and degree certificates and whatever.
So how did your siblings handle this? Do you still have contact?
I don't, unfortunately. That's been one of the most painful things for me, that my siblings have no contact with me, and have, I hate to say sided, but don't see things in the same way that I do.
So do they share the same views as your parents?
I don't know. We've not discussed it. I'm the eldest, and it's been several years now since we've spoken. And at the time when I left, we're still children, I guess technically considered children, but late teens, so of the age where you start to have your own independent thoughts. So it's very, very difficult for me to answer that question honestly or having a good understanding. I would say, well, they've lived in that household and they decided to go, to disagree or to not follow my thoughts on things, or, to turn against me and whatever. Because I did receive some nasty messages when I decided to leave from them as well. But how much of that is still being under the thumb of very, very powerful and oppressive people that you're dependent on, I think financially as well. When you're living in someone's house, you're paying the bills and, paying for everything, then to what extent can you really know what's actually their feelings and what they're being coerced to say? It's coercive control. So I don't know. Yeah. I hope not.
If they wanted to reach out, would there be a way for them to do that?
It's complicated. I won't go into it in case they're listening. They probably won't be, but just in case they do come across this, they know that there is a way, but my concern is the safety concerns that I mentioned earlier on in our conversation. To what extent do it's about risk assessment, especially because I'm a parent of young children, and our safety, emotional and physical safety, is paramount.
No, of course. Was it hard to leave your old belief system?
My belief system, I don't think it was a very strongly held belief system when I really dig down deep. So no, because I think I left it a very long time ago. I think when you're very young, and I don't want to stereotype, but I think when, parents who do raise their children religious when they're very young, their children go along with things. I think there's a lot of maybe pleasing your parents, so doing what you're told in order to kind of see their approval. I think I definitely had a lot of that experience. I think as soon as I became old enough to believe for myself, I went along with things because I believed that that was the right thing to do. And because I was being abused, it was like actually it was more a safety thing. I think having left and now being kind of through the other side, I don't think it was a very strongly held belief system.
Do you ever see yourself making amends with your parents?
No, definitely not. I hope with my siblings, I really do, because being the eldest, and this is a cultural thing as well, but being the eldest, I was more of a kind of a second parent and maybe more of the more reasonable parent figure. But no, that they did far too much damage, and the trust is all gone, and some of the things that were said were, I think, unforgivable. But not so much about forgiveness, but more in terms of there's just no way.
Yeah.
No way, and
How?
can't.
No, of course. How common do you think the extremism that your family believed in is common in Britain?
I think the beliefs. I think it is more common than a lot of people would like to admit to, in terms of, views on, not so much views on the killing of innocents. I don't think that is very common. I really don't. But I think things that we experience directly, that if somebody leaves their faith, that they deserve to be killed. If something has textual evidence to support it, it's very difficult to argue that people are not going to hold that dear if the text is supposed to be the immutable word of God. I think if any, people do hold these beliefs, it's something that is not voiced at all. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. I don't know, but I do think more people than they would care to admit would hold views that liberal-minded people would judge to be extreme, right? Because extremism itself is like a really broad category. You've got extremism like Hitler was a hero. I don't think many people believe that as well at all, and I really hope they don't. But you've got, well, if you change your religion, then you deserve anything terrible to happen to you. I do think that's perhaps more common than some would like to admit.
Is there a conflict between the more extreme side and the non-extreme side?
What do you mean by conflict?
Like, is there any discussion or interaction? I would imagine because of the crossover. So, like, the Muslim people that I've spoke to would always say that the extremist, they wouldn't class them as Muslims.
Yeah, for sure.
So I wondered
and vice versa, I would say. Like, I think that a lot of people who hold the kind of attitudes that were held by my parents, or are held by my parents, they're still alive, would consider people who don't follow those beliefs as non-Muslims. And I think this comes down to what, the fact that there in theory should be no room for individual interpretation in a text that is considered to be the word of God. And I think that's where the faith maybe differs from other world religions, which don't suggest that this is direct divine revelation or whatever it might be. So in the West, obviously, it's a big melting pot. I grew up in a big city. I don't live there anymore, but it's a quite diverse city, and you've got people from all backgrounds and all levels of religiosity. But it's interesting because even within the kind of the extremist mindset, they would still do things which a lot of other people would say is completely like unacceptable. Like, there's a drink that people make on weddings and it's like fermented fruit. It's basically alcohol. But if you were to go down, if they were to see somebody drinking vodka or something, that would be, and they were Muslim, that would be completely unacceptable. But if people get a little bit tipsy on this fermented drink, it's not seen as the same thing, and this is where the kind of the logic, completely falls down.
I've heard of this drink. What's this called?
And that's different names for it, but the one that I know is like called sherbet. It's like sherbet, but it's not sherbet.
I've heard this. I've
There's different versions in different countries, I'm sure, but it's like, yeah, basically fermented fruit that's made over a couple of days. Normally you find it in like big Fanta bottles at parties, and people literally pass it around. But you can see there that that's getting intoxicated, as a consequence of the drunk. That's what alcohol does to you, intoxicates you. But the idea of they heard about somebody who would call themselves a Muslim, and then, in fact, my family were really upset that some family friends owned a restaurant, and they didn't have a. It was like bring your own food to the restaurant. It was a restaurant in England. They were completely furious and so judgmental that they would do that, because that would be allowing people to drink on your premises, drinking alcohol. And that would be completely un-Islamic. So you can see how that, it's completely doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I've seen there's a few restaurants in the area around me that have the same idea, which is, like, we don't serve it, but you're more than welcome to bring it.
But that's not, in my family's mindset, that is really wrong too, because they follow the belief that you shouldn't share you shouldn't allow any alcohol on your premises, or any, sit on the same table where alcohol is served. It's one of those things where that's just how they functioned. That's just how they functioned as people. And I think, finding judgment everywhere and almost, enjoying spreading these opinions. But I think it was just as I got older that I noticed that these things were getting more and more and more radical.
Yeah.
But it was just accepted. And I do think it was something that was part of a wider community, but I do think they were on the worst side of it, because you had the layers of emotional abuse that were in there as well. Like I said, anything that's powerful document that gets into the wrong hands.
Has the nature of extremism changed since the days you were brought up around it? Did the tone shift, like, after each terrorist act and after each thing happened? Is there like an escalation?
I don't know. I think for me, it's more that each time a terrorist attack happened, you've got more, and I think governments are to blame for this as well, but you've got more and more scrutiny of immigrant communities. And when people get, are really scrutinized and kind of over policed and watched and demonized by the press and by the government, you have this sense of people, closing in on themselves, right? And not, being really, really afraid. And I think that demonization actually fuels this kind of behavior, because it means that it like perpetuates this us and them narrative. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think there is a link between rising levels of attacks and then therefore people feeling that they are not a part of the society that they're in. And I think that was the case in my family, that as I got older and as things began to become more and more about, that's what those Muslims are doing, it was, well, they don't like us anyway. So, here are our beliefs. You are different to us. This is the West and this is us. And you can integrate to a certain extent. You can exploit the country for, what it will give you, like your education and your job and whatever. But at the end of the day, these are our values.
And are there any misconceptions that people have about this extremist way of life and lifestyle? Is there something that...
Well, I think there's a misconception. I think there's a misconception about people assuming that this only affects people with, like, as your question said, were your parents educated? Uneducated people who perhaps don't want to or don't appear to integrate in their communities. Maybe it's kind of a particularly, it's a particular location which just has people from the same background, almost like a kind of a ghetto mentality. And I think that's ignoring, quite widespread beliefs, because there's a big difference between beliefs and kind of chat and even jokes that are totally inappropriate jokes, and what people would actually do, and that you don't need to be joining, running off and joining ISIS in order to still have those beliefs, and in some way almost like upholding the sense and like legitimizing that kind of behavior. But the biggest one that I get, and I think that's why as well, that's why I think my school and the kind of the adults around me when I was a child who witnessed some things, or like the language I was talking about earlier on, didn't do anything about it, because it was, well, we don't want to be seen as XYZ, we don't want to be seen as demonizing community or being racist or whatever. But I think there is a misconception that this just affects some people, and you can have a belief, but not necessarily act on it.
No, of course. And finally, before we get into, because we've got a couple of questions here, what does the future hold for you?
That's a big question. I mean, I think I just carry on. I'm settled. I'm lucky. I think that's the big thing, is I've worked in this sector. I've worked in the violence against women and girls sector. I've worked in honour-based violence. I continue to. I think I realise I am lucky. I also think that I just carry on. Doing what I can, and this is why opportunities like this are quite good, because I can take steps to protect myself. I can say what I want to, and all things private that I need to for safeguarding, and just talk about the unacceptability of certain behaviours, and that you can be black, white, purple, but you can still hold really damaging beliefs, and that this does happen everywhere, even if people don't talk about it.
No, of course, and we are really grateful for you taking the time to come on and chat. Really we are grateful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So do we have a question to come through?
What age? Family.
Yeah, sorry.
So I was in my late 20s. I think the beliefs had definitely waned much, much earlier. And I left home, though not the family and, in the same way as I have now. I left home when I was 18. I went off, I got good grades. I went off to university, and I made a point of really putting up a fight to leave the city that I grew up in. That wasn't easy, because there is a belief, very conservative views on particularly girls, and where they should stay at home. But so I left at 18 and kind of gradually started putting in place steps to become more independent, but leaving in the sense of completely stepping away from and going no contact. Was about 10 years after that.
How did your husband handle this conflict?
It's very, very difficult. You can't. I mean, I'm sure you can begin to imagine, but it puts a huge strain on a relationship. Fear and anxiety. I think we're very lucky to have each other. I'm very lucky to have him, but really, it takes. He didn't. We often joke now that if he knew half of what he was getting himself into, he wouldn't have, gone near me at all. But one step at a time, and I think we're lucky that in both of our jobs as well, that we both understand safeguarding quite a lot. We've got a lot of experience with it, so we both work public sector. But it was hard, and it did take its toll. And to a certain extent, we're still, I guess, recovering from that. Going back to having like normal arguments that couples have, rather than the quite significant, are we going to be physically okay? Should we move house? What should we do? They're going to turn up at the job, at my job, and do I need to get security involved and escort me to the car park? Kind of conversations. That's quite heavy when you're not the oldest. So
no, of course, but I imagine that knowing that there's going to be something kind of must help going into it. Like, Yeah. And have you thought about how you're going to explain this to your children? Like, have you thought about that conversation?
We
Because
have, yeah. It's very, very difficult. The children were around. They were babies when this all took place, when the big kickoff happened, which was, I can't even tell you how frightening that was. Really, really, really frightening, especially when you've got a global pandemic just, lumped in there just to help things along. I think it's going to have to be a gradual thing. I think, as they get older, I think it's going to be, first of all, understanding why we see daddy's mummy and daddy, but we don't see mummy's mummy and daddy. I think that's, that's probably going to be something which we come across in the next few years. I think from there, it's got to be a gradual thing, because I need to really be conscious of them feeling in any way responsible, or they were a huge factor in terms of like taking an important step. Like sometimes you need something like outside yourself, don't you, to be able to take ownership. But like I said, that group that I'm part of volunteers working on honour-based abuse, that they've been a real mine of information in terms of how to approach this. But I think when they're older, when they're, I like to think that, as they move into adulthood, they'll have a full understanding of this. And obviously I'm not naive. I know I can't stop them from, if they wanted to go out and seek out their family, whatever, I can't stop them. But I'd like to think that they would be able to have an understanding of the drastic steps that we've had to take to keep them safe.
Yeah, that's talking about safeguarding. That's very dangerous now if they decide to then go looking for a family that.
You're right. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, look, there's an age factor to this as well. My parents aren't getting any younger, but I think you asked me before about my siblings, and that is where it gets really complicated, because I don't know where my siblings' heads are at. I don't know. Like, I grew up in this environment, but friends of mine who know this are like, how did you turn out so, normal or whatever? And I genuinely think it's because from a very, very young age, I felt like the black sheep. I didn't fit in. I just didn't fit in. And I had a lot of friends who were from different communities, and I made a point of doing that. And I think that's what exposed me to new ideas. I don't know where my siblings' heads are at. So it is safeguarding. And that's the most, that's paramount at the end of the day. But I think we're a long way off than being able to.
Another question. For somebody in that situation that's looking to get out, do you have any advice?
Safety first is the biggest one. So I'm part of a Reddit group online, and this comes up a lot. Like, I want to get out. I need to. I would say, number one, make sure that you are very careful of who you talk to, because these networks of people, and people do, dox each other, and they do, reveal information and whatever. And these people make a point of trying to find out people like this. But first of all, make sure that you are safe. If you need to pretend, if you need to kind of stay under the roof until you're completely independent, make sure that you've got your finances in order, and also your physical safety. But there are some really, really good organisations that are starting to learn more about this in the UK. So, for example, Karma Nirvana, honour-based abuse. Depending on which city you live in, there are some specific ones as well. But literally Googling honour-based abuse or anything like this, and then going from there.
We're going to put the links to some of these below as well.
I would say, and Karma Nirvana are absolutely fantastic. They have helplines, but just be really, really careful. Be careful what you post online. Be careful what you're putting on social media. Turn off your location settings. The lengths that people can go to track down people, and are quite significant. And in hindsight, I know I had a lot of very, very near misses. Just be careful. Just be safe and be careful.
The final question that's coming up on this side, something that's been or was very prominent in the news up until recently, the Shamima Begum story.
Yeah.
And obviously she left with two friends who now haven't been seen or heard from in a number of years.
Mm.
What do you think about that? What do you...
I followed the story really intently, and there was the brilliant podcast recently with Josh Baker on it. Extremely conflicted. My background, professional background, I'm a teacher, and I work with teenagers. You know, secondary is my specialism. And on the one hand, I think Shamima Begum was groomed. We know she was groomed. We know that she was massively influenced. We know also that she didn't grow up in a religious household. She wasn't religious as a young woman at all. So to what extent do I think, I mean, I don't know, but I think what we need to remember with her is she has spent a lot of time in a radicalized country. She's completely ruined her life. You know, she's lost 3 children. She's probably going to be, you know, her life is completely destroyed. But at the same time, to what extent can you grow up in that environment, also live in that environment and come out of it completely unaffected by it? Like, you know, I've sat here having this conversation with you, and you might say the same thing about me, like, you grew up in this environment, how do I know that you don't believe these things as well? But I think with Shamima Begum, the most important thing is I do think she should come back and stand trial over here. I really do. I don't think it's, you know, she's not anybody other country's problem. My husband calls it human fly tipping. You know, she's our problem. We need to deal with her. We need to remember she was 15. But equally, it does sound like there was a lot of thought that went into the decision to go out to. And that's a very, very drastic decision. You know, actions, there's a big gulf. And I think what I've tried to demonstrate today in our chat is that there's a huge gulf between words and actions. And she did the action. So how much of the words and everything did she actually hold dear? I don't know.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And is there any final thoughts that you want to throw out before we close this?
No, not at all. I'd say, yeah, post those links for sure.
Yeah, we'll put it down below.
Yeah, I think that just be careful. And I think that it's just about, you know, it's just about staying safe at the end of the day. But I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for watching 20 Questions With. We really appreciate it. Before you do anything, if you haven't liked and subscribed, do that. But if you're going to drop a comment, before you write anything, please just take a moment, think about what you're going to write. I promise it makes all the difference. Thank you so much. Bye.